Okay, welcome back to Online Economics. In this particular lecture, we're going to be studying fiscal policy. So, in the previous lectures or series of lectures, we introduced aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and then we used the tools of aggregate supply and aggregate demand to explain macroeconomic equilibrium. So, the first thing to remember is that we're talking about the three big important variables when it comes to macroeconomics, which are economic growth measured by GDP or real GDP, unemployment, the rate of unemployment, and the rate of inflation, the general price level in the economy. So those are the three important tools we used as a barometer, as a measuring yardstick to say, okay, what's going on with our economy. So when something is awry, if we're in a recession or there's significant demand pull inflation, the question is there any tools available to the federal government to alleviate some of the pain and suffering of a significant or severe recession or to curb demand pull inflation. So fiscal policy really has its roots in an economist named John Maynard Keynes. He was the first person to write extensively on the government interactions in a capitalist system. So to understand fiscal policy, we have to introduce some important ideas first, and that is, what do I mean by the federal budget, right? So the federal budget. Each year, the federal government takes in trillions of dollars in tax revenues from personal income taxes, corporate taxes, excise taxes, social security taxes. Right, so a whole list or litany of taxes. Likewise, the federal government spends lots of money on social welfare programs, on social capital, so obviously on unemployment benefits, on um, social security benefits, on welfare benefits. The government spends a lot of money on military spending. The federal government spends money on education and infrastructure, roads and bridges and stuff. So the question is, at the end of the year, if we measure or we take the difference between what we collect in taxes versus what we spend, right? So every year the government has a projected budget, and with these projections, we have a rough estimate on whether or not tax receipts, tax revenues, will cover, so to speak, government spending, right? So in 1 year's time, we would have a balanced budget if federal government expenditures exactly equaled tax revenues. Right? That's what we refer to as a balanced budget. Right? Unfortunately, for the vast majority of years, especially in the recent past, we've had federal budget deficits. In other words, government expenditures are greater than tax revenues, right? So we're going to look numerically at some of the deficits over the years. We're going to talk about deficits versus over the different administrations of the United States and why these deficits occur, right? So a federal budget deficit simply means that the federal government spends more money on transfer payments and social capital and military spending than the government takes in tax revenues. If obviously in 1 year we have a situation where tax revenues are greater than government spending, we would have a federal budget surplus. All right, so the deficit, the debt, right? So 1 year is if tax revenues are less than federal government spending, we have a federal budget deficit. If we add up all of the deficits over time, so like it says here, the accumulation, right? Now, of course, we subtract out those surpluses, right? That would give us the national debt. And today it's June of 2012. The national debt in the United States is somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 trillion, right? So the accumulation of all of our deficits over the 200 plus years we've been a country, we now are in debt $15 trillion, right? Now, well, what does that mean, and how do we finance that? All right. Well, in the previous slide we talked about if government expenditures are greater than tax receipts, we have a federal budget deficit. The question is, how does the federal government finance the deficit? Right? Well, the federal government finances the deficit by borrowing, right? And the primary tool of borrowing is government bonds. In other words, the federal government sells federal government bonds, right? So you hear these as T-bills or T-bonds. So there's a 1 year, a 2 year, a 5 year, a 7 year, a 10 year, and now we brought back the 30-year bond, right? So all different individuals and institutions across the globe buy federal government debt. Right? So, if you're a person who may be, say, 65 to 75 years old, and over the course of your lifetime you may have accumulated $500,000 in savings, and you want to invest your money in some financial instrument that's relatively secure, right? According to financial markets and the world of econ and finance, the government, the debt issued by the United States federal government is still the safest financial instrument in the world. So in other words, if you want to park your money somewhere where you have a 99.99% chance of return, you could buy U.S. government debt, right? So then you ask it, well, who buys debt and why would they buy government debt? Right? People buy debt for different reasons. So the example I just gave you, if somebody in their retirement years wants to have a little bit of return that's guaranteed, but doesn't want to take any risk in stock markets or other types of investments, real estate or currencies, those type of individuals might invest in or might buy government bonds. Right? Insurance companies buy government bonds and banks buy government bonds mostly because they're required by law to have a certain portfolio of secure, safe investments. Right? The other big institutions that buy government bonds across the globe are both foreign corporations and foreign countries, and we'll talk about how China and Japan buying government debt in the United States alters the exchange rate between the United States and those countries' currencies. All right, so here we have federal government surpluses and deficits as a percentage of GDP. All right, going all the way back to 1947, right? So 1947, we have government surpluses and deficits as a percentage of total economic output. All right, so you can see that for the vast majority of years, we've had federal budget deficits. That is to say, all of the years where the blue bar graphs are below the 0% there, right? So we did have a few years in the late 90s where we had a federal government surplus, right, where the economy was operating at or beyond full employment domestic output. But for the vast majority of this time, we've had federal budget deficits. Now, you can also see that this particular chart goes all the way out to 2019. So from 2007 or 8 on, because that's when this was created, those are actually projections about where we might be in the future. All right, here's the same idea, but this is a good graph because it shows you the national debt as a percentage of GDP, national debt as a percentage of GDP, same idea conveyed here, through different administrations. And you can see that right before Truman took office, the national debt as a percentage of GDP was up near 120%. And the reason for this, during World War II, the government borrowed in very large amounts to finance the war effort. So when Roosevelt took office, he was nervous about a $15 billion federal budget deficit at the beginning of the Great Depression. But during the height of the war, the deficit soared to somewhere near $115 billion, right? So we needed to borrow the federal government borrowed and ran huge deficits and ran up the national debt as a percentage of GDP because of the war effort. Right? And then you can see that post World War II, the national debt as a percentage of GDP dropped quite significantly until really the Reagan buildup during the Cold War in the 80s. Right? And this also typically ebbs and flows with the economy. In other words, the better the economy performs, right, the less we have to worry about federal budget deficits because a stronger economy, the federal government collects more in tax revenues and therefore tends to run lower deficits or even possibly government surpluses. Right? Here we have the same idea again. This is federal budget deficits as a percentage of GDP by administration. Right? So you can see that more recently, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, all of these presidents ran deficits to some extent. And then you can see our current president has an enormous federal budget deficit, right? So when Barack Obama took office in 2008, the country was just in the midst of a recession, and we've run historic federal budget deficits over the course of his administration. So after World War II, when we had the Great Depression, the post-war Depression economy, the government decided that we must do everything in our power to never allow a Great Depression to occur in the United States or ever again if possible. So in 1946 we had the Employment Act, right? So what came out of this was two things: the Council of Economic Advisors and the Joint Economic Committee, but more importantly, a mandate on the federal government that our our president and both houses are required now by law to do everything within their power to sustain full employment domestic output. In other words, if fiscal policy measures are in order to alleviate either a severe recession or to rein in demand pull inflation, the federal government by law is now required to do everything within its means, within its power, to assist the economy in achieving full employment domestic output. So when we talk about fiscal policy, right, every year there is going to be a certain level of government spending and a certain level of taxation. So remember back to the beginning of this course, we said economic thinking is marginal thinking, changes in the status quo. Right? Taxes are never going to go away, and neither is government spending going to completely vanish. So when we discuss fiscal policy, right, there's two types of fiscal policy. There's discretionary fiscal policy, and then there's non-discretionary fiscal policy. The fiscal policy we're discussing and we're investigating here is discretionary fiscal policy. In other words, active changes to either government spending or the level of taxation, right, in an effort to affect aggregate demand, right? So we're going to see graphically how and why the federal government employs fiscal policy to affect the economy through affecting aggregate demand, right? So when we discuss fiscal policy, we're going to talk about discretionary fiscal policy, active changes in either the level of taxation or the level of government spending, or maybe some of both, to affect the economy. So as we said, fiscal policy will be aimed at affecting aggregate demand, right? So we say, why are we concentrating on aggregate demand? What's the the rationale there? And the belief is that changes in government level of taxation and or government spending can have an impact on aggregate demand, which will have short-run impacts on the level of employment in the country and level of inflation or price stability. Right? So the belief is that the post World War II Keynesian understanding of the economy is that discretionary fiscal policy can impact aggregate demand and therefore have some impact on the unemployment rate and the rate of inflation in the economy. Right? Let's assume for a minute that the economy is in a recession. Right? We're gonna look at this using two graphs. Right? So if the economy is in a recession, before we go any further, we say, okay, there's four phases of the business cycle. The expansionary phase of the business cycle, where the economy is growing, GDP is positive, unemployment tends to be low, and price level starts to creep up a bit, right? And then the peak where inflation tends to be a problem. So a recession is when aggregate demand is weak, right? GDP is negative, and the unemployment rate is the real issue, right? So that's the problem during an economic recession. So okay, well, what can be done in order to alleviate this problem from the standpoint of the federal government, right? Are there fiscal policy options available for Uncle Sam to employ to assist the U.S. economy on getting back on track? So the first idea is that if the economy is in a recession, the proper fiscal policy options are referred to as expansionary fiscal policy options. All right, so expansionary fiscal policy, in other words, we want an increase in aggregate demand. We want the federal government to stimulate economic activity, right? To stimulate economic activity. So there's really three choices here. The first one is simple enough: increase government spending. So if we think about our good friend aggregate demand and what drives aggregate demand, right? We said, remember, aggregate demand is total spending by all buyers in the market, which is C plus I plus G plus X. So if the private sector spending, if consumer expenditures on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services is rather weak, and specifically it's usually durable goods and some services, right? If discretionary spending is weak, or if gross business investment is lagging, so there's not a whole bunch of corporations out there buying new equipment or purchasing new machines or building new factory space, right? So if the private sector is weak, can the federal government step in and spend money? So you watch that video on the Great Depression and the Keynesian Revolution. The idea here is that if private sector spending is not strong enough to sustain full employment domestic output, right? If the private sector is not getting it done, can the government step in and spend money? Well, that's the belief that that's why there's a decent number of economists and politicians believe in fiscal policy that government spending can fill that gap left by the private sector. And they say, well, what would the government spend money on? Well, you know, the government can spend money on infrastructure, it can spend money on education, it can spend money on military output, right? So the idea is that if the government spends money, that this will fill in the gap left by the private sector spending and should shift aggregate demand to the right. Right. Another option is reducing the level of taxation. Right. So reducing. So if you think about the average person making let's say 50 $60,000 a year pre-tax income. There's two ways that the federal government can reduce the tax burden of individuals. They can give us a one lump time sum, so like a one-time check, or they can just simply reduce the amount of taxes we're paying, in each of our paychecks. So when George Bush took office in 2000, the economy was in a recession, and George Bush decided to go with the former idea is that simply send everyone a check, a one-time check for $800 or $1,200. When Barack Obama took office, he decided on the other approach, which is simply reduce the amount of monies of tax revenues that the federal government is collecting from individual taxpayers, through their paychecks. And both of those approaches have merit. Neither one has proved to be any more effective than the other. But the idea here is that if we reduce the level of taxation, right, that leaves more money in the pockets of people to spend, right, hardworking Americans, and then of course they'll spend money, right? And then of course it doesn't matter if we talk about the increase in the government spending or the lowering of tax rates for individuals. The same idea of the multiplier would hopefully have an impact on economic activity as well, right? So if the government spends money or if the government reduces taxes and individuals start to spend money, we hope to get a multiplied effect from this increase in spending. Right? Now the next option, simple, is that simply use a combination of increased government spending and tax reductions. And this typically is what ends up happening, especially if you think about the way our government functions. In other words, right, you have Democrats and Republicans, and they're probably going to be not altogether agreeing on, do we want to increase government spending on social welfare programs or on infrastructure, or do we simply want to reduce taxes? Right. So typically, more conservative politicians tend to advocate lower tax rates, letting individuals take more of their pay home, and letting the private sector drive the economy. And fans of bigger government, or people who are more on the Democratic or left-leaning side of the aisle, they typically want an increase in government spending, right, as part of the package for the fiscal policy option if there is a recession and expansionary fiscal policy is in order. Well, let's look at this graphically. All right, so let's assume for a moment that we're at full employment domestic output. We're at full employment domestic output. Everything looks okay for a while, and then unfortunately there is a leftward shift in aggregate demand. Right, there's a leftward shift in aggregate demand. So you see that AD2 has shifted left. So this could be caused by a financial bubble where stock markets drop significantly and consumers have less money to spend. Right, it could be caused by the housing industry faltering. Right, gross business investment is weak. Right, so aggregate demand has shifted to the left, and we're below full employment domestic output. So if we're in a recession, now these numbers are just estimates. Okay, so it depends on how severe the recession is, what the duration of the recession is, what the cause of the recession may be, and you learn this when you learn business cycles that every business cycle is not the same. Right? How bad is a recession? Do we have a 6%, an 8%, a 12% drop in real GDP? Right? Does unemployment get as high as 7, 8, 9%? It all depends on the severity of the recession. But let's assume for a moment that we've had a decrease in aggregate demand where the unemployment rate gets up near 9.5% like it did in 2008, right? 2008, and GDP is negative to the tune of say like 1.5 to 2%, so somewhere between a 1.5% drop and a 2% drop in GDP. Right? Well, during that time period, there's going to be very little upward pressure on prices. So with this leftward shift of aggregate demand, our current measurement of our three macroeconomic variables is, say, GDP is negative, say negative 1.5%, 2%. Unemployment is high, say 9%, and inflation is not a problem, 1.1%. So there's no increase in the price level here. Well, what can the federal government do to alleviate this situation? All right. Well, we just went over this in the previous slide. The federal government has three tools at its disposal, three options, fiscal policy options to expand spending. So the expansionary fiscal policy options would be an increase in government spending, a reduction in the level of tax rates, or some combination of the both. And so let's assume that the federal government increases government spending. So the federal government increases government spending by $5 billion, right? What will happen? What would be the impact or the total effect on GDP? Well, assuming we have some multiplied effect, right? We would hope that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right by 20 billion, right? So real quick review here. I've been doing this for a while, so I can do this in my head. All right, so we say, okay, well, if the full impact was $20 billion and there was a $5 billion increase in government spending, well, that means the multiplier must have been 4, right? So 4 times 5 got us to $20 billion, right? That meant the marginal propensity to consume in this particular economy was 0.75 or 75%. And then obviously the marginal propensity to save was 0.25, 25%. So assume a marginal propensity to consume of 0.75 and a multiplier of 4. If the government were to go ahead and inject $5 billion worth of spending into the economy, right, the assumed effect would be a $20 billion increase in aggregate demand. And now you understand what the impact of fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy, can be on the overall economy. That the government can spend money, right, in order to stimulate economic activity, right? Now, before we go any further, a couple ideas. Number one is that if the government decides to not use an increase in government spending, but to go the other route to reduce taxes, any tax reductions would have to be larger than increases in government spending for the very reason we studied when we talked about marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. If the government reduces taxes across the board for hardworking Americans, right, what's going to happen? The government wants people to go out there and spend that money, right? So if the government gives everyone, $1,000, right, they want everyone to go ahead and spend that $1,000 as the federal government desires. However, we know that there'll be Frugal Frank and Sally Saber, and some people won't spend all of the money, right? So they're going to save a part of the money. So if there's an increase if there's a tax reduction, right, and on average people spend 75% of that tax reduction, right, and save 25% of that tax reduction, then any reduction in tax rates, that particular fiscal stimulus is going to have to be greater than the increase in government spending, right? All right, so 2 more ideas, and then we'll move on to the possibility of fiscal policy using as a way to combat demand pull inflation. Right. So number 1, assume we had a balanced federal budget to begin with. Right. If the federal budget was balanced to begin with, it doesn't matter if the federal government cuts taxes, increases government spending, or uses some combination of the both. We are definitely going to run a federal budget deficit. Right. So there's going to be a deficit associated with expansionary fiscal policy. And it gets to the very heart of economics, right? There's always a cost. There's always a trade-off. We can't lower tax rates and increase government spending during a recession and assume that there's no impact on the budget for the federal government, right? So expansionary fiscal policy, while positive as far as influencing or stimulating economic activity, has one drawback, and that is we will run a federal budget deficit to finance this expansionary fiscal policy, right? Last idea is something we refer to again is, which one's better? Should we reduce taxes? Should we increase government spending? Right? Well, typically a combination of the both is the best approach here. Some combination of increasing government spending and cutting tax rates.